Good morning. I hope that you are doing well. And today we are doing our first devotional on the 1 Year Bible. As such, it's going to be a little bit longer than the rest of them will be because we're covering so much ground. We're covering 8 days today. And so this devotional is going to be a little bit longer. And so I hope that you will stick with it. And I pray that you have been reading your Bible and that God has been speaking to your heart and has been showing some things to you. Hopefully, some new things that you've never noticed before. And I pray that you are drawing closer to Him. I want to start this morning by going to the Lord in prayer, and then we will get right into this. Our righteous God and Heavenly Father, we bow before you and we thank you so much for your word. We thank you that we are in a new year. And God, that while the world is in distress, and Father, while we see a lot of wickedness taking place, we can just hide under the shadow of your wings. And Father, that we can read your word, we can study it, we can pray to you, talk to you, commune with you, and draw close to you. And Father, that you will give us peace in the middle of all of the chaos that's going on all around us. And God, I just pray that you would do that now, that you would give your people peace, comfort, to know that you are in control. And God, I just pray that we would be busy serving you and doing the things that you desire for us to do. We exalt you and praise you. In Jesus' name, amen. Alrighty, so Matthew. So again, we're doing January 1st through January 8th, and so this will take a little bit longer than these will into the future. But Matthew chapter number 1, okay? We're not going to go verse by verse. We're not going to be reading all of this together. The design for this is that you read these things on your own, and then this is more of just an overview. And then I want to share some things that stood out to me. And so Matthew chapter number 1 starts right off with the lineage of Jesus. In verse number 1, it says, "The book of the generation of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham." And so Matthew gives the lineage of Jesus, and it goes back to Abraham. And the reason for that is because the Gospel of Matthew is about Jesus being the Messiah, or him being the king. And so he goes back to Abraham because that's what the Jews needed. Father Abraham, if you remember that song, and they needed that in order to see that Jesus truly is the Messiah. He really is the king that comes from the lineage of Abraham. At the end of the chapter, it goes into the birth of Jesus. And we just recently celebrated Christmas and talked about the birth of the Savior. But something that stood out to me in Matthew chapter number 1 as I was reading it is verse number 17. And I want to read that to you. At the end of all of those people that it lists in the lineage, and I know that you can read that, and a lot of times people just want to skip over that. But it's very significant and very important to understand the Bible as a whole. And so nothing in the Bible is insignificant. And so this lineage is very significant. But something that stood out to me is verse 17. It says, "So all the generations from Abraham to David are 14 generations. And from David until the carrying away into Babylon are 14 generations. And from the carrying away into Babylon unto Christ are 14 generations." That just blows my mind. So from Abraham to David, there's 14 generations. From David until the captivity, there's 14 generations. And then from the captivity to Jesus, there's 14 generations. This shows that God was in control of all of this. And everything happened in his perfect timing. And I'm reminded of, in the book of Galatians, if I remember right, it talks about when the fullness of time came, that he was born of a woman or a virgin. And so at the perfect time, Jesus Christ arrives on the scene and was born. And so only God could have done that. In chapter number 2 of Matthew, we find the wise men come to worship Jesus. And then Herod was threatened, and so because of that, he makes a decree to kill all of the children 2 years old and under. This was prophesied in the Old Testament, in Jeremiah 31, verse 15, that this would take place and this would happen. Um, so then we find that an angel appears to Joseph and tells him to take the child to Egypt in order for him to be protected. And so they sneak away into Egypt, and then when Herod dies, they come back and they settle in Nazareth. This also was prophesied in the Old Testament. Something that stood out to me in Matthew chapter 2 is there was so much prophecy being unfolded surrounding the birth of Jesus. And what's interesting is that some people have claimed that Jesus intentionally fulfilled prophecies in order to pretend like he was the Messiah. But can I tell you that these prophecies here in particular, what control did this little baby have over where he lived, over where he was born? Understand that these things happened before he could even walk or even talk. And so the reason that these things occurred is not because Jesus forced them to happen or intentionally did them. It's because God is wonderful and God knows all things, and knew exactly how these things were going to unfold and how they were going to come to pass. And so that's what you find in the prophecies in the Old Testament, is God foretelling of how these things were going to occur. Chapter number 3, John the Baptist arrives on the scene, and he begins preaching a message of repentance. John the Baptist, I've said it before, I'll say it again. When I read about him, I picture some guy today on a Harley out in the middle of nowhere. John the Baptist was a rough dude, right? And he was bold and in your face. And he comes and he preaches, repent. And then we find that John the Baptist is baptizing people. Many of the Pharisees and Sadducees come to be baptized by John, and he rebukes them because their hearts were unchanged. He calls them a generation of vipers. A lot of times today people think that, we have to be so nice and flowery and all this stuff. John looked right at these wicked people and said, you are a generation of snakes, a generation of vipers. And so then we find at the end that Jesus comes to be baptized by John the Baptist. John doesn't want to do it at first, but Jesus tells him, no, you need to do this. And the Bible says there that he suffers it, or he allows it, or he does it. Jesus at this time is about 30 years old, and he is beginning his public ministry. Something that stood out to me in Matthew chapter 3, verses 16 and 17, and I want to read that to you, verses 16 and 17. It says, And Jesus, when he was baptized, went up straightway out of the water. And lo, the heavens were opened unto him, and he saw the Spirit of God descending like a dove, and lighting upon him. And lo, a voice from heaven saying, This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. And so it still amazes me, no matter how many times I read this. You see the Trinity here. You see the Father speaking. You see the Spirit descending. And Jesus was there, was the one that was getting baptized. And the Father says, This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. In chapter number 4, what's interesting, Jesus gets baptized, and then immediately after that, chapter 4 starts with Jesus being led by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. Jesus is tempted 3 times, but each time he gives back the Word of God. And can I tell you that that's our defense? When we are tempted, we need to respond with the Word of God. After that, it shows that John is cast into prison, and it says that Jesus goes down to the Sea of Galilee and he calls out Peter and Andrew and James and John, and they leave their nets and they immediately follow him. We find then that multitudes begin to follow Jesus as he taught in the synagogues and he preached the gospel. He also healed many that were sick. Something that stands out to me here is verse number 11, right after Jesus is tempted those 3 times by the devil. Verse 11 says this, it says, "Then the devil leaveth him, and behold, angels came and ministered to him." And so can I tell you that that encourages me, because they do the same for us today. That when we do not give in to the devil's temptation and his traps, that the angels of God minister to us. They strengthen us, and what a beautiful, beautiful picture that is. In chapter number 5 of the Gospel of Matthew, we go into the Sermon on the Mount. The Sermon on the Mount begins. Now, we're not going to go too much into the Sermon on the Mount. We have been studying this on Wednesday evenings, and those recordings are on the YouTube channel. And so I would encourage you, if you have not listened to those or watched those, you can watch those. And we're going through the Sermon on the Mount, and so I'm not going to go too much into that. But I will say that he starts the Sermon on the Mount with the Beatitudes, the blesseds, right? And then he goes into the fact that we are the salt and we are the light. And then it goes into this big long section, Jesus talking about how he didn't come to do away with the law, but to fulfill it. And we see that Jesus raises the bar, he raises the standard, and in several different aspects and areas. You move into chapter number 6, and still the Sermon on the Mount. And Jesus tells them not to be like the religious leaders and do things for the outward appearance. Things like giving alms, praying, fasting. Don't do those things so that others might see you, but let those things be between you and God. And at the end of chapter 6, Jesus reveals that we should focus on the kingdom of heaven, and all our needs will be met as a result of that. In chapter 7, verses 1 to 14, Jesus reveals that we will be judged by the same standard that we judge others by. He then goes on into asking things of our Father, and we learn that our Father is a giver. We must ask him for things and ask him for the things that our heart desires. And when our heart lines up with his desire, then he gives. And understand that God is a great giver. And so many people don't have because they never ask. Finally, in verses 13 and 14, Jesus talks about the straight gate and the broad way versus the narrow path. And so we want to make sure that we are on the narrow path. Broad is the way that goes to destruction. And so that's what we've seen so far in the Gospel of Matthew. I hope that you are enjoying reading this wonderful book of the Bible. Now we are going to move to the Psalms, and from January 1st to January 8th, it went from Psalm 1 to Psalm 8. And again, I'm not going to be reading through each psalm and going verse by verse, but just kind of giving an overview and what these psalms are about. In Psalm 1, we find here the individual who does righteously is blessed. And it says, "Blessed is the man that walketh not in the counsel of the ungodly, nor standeth in the way of sinners, nor sitteth in the seat of the scornful." We find that it's contrasted with the ungodly, and the ungodly will perish. It may appear like they're doing okay now. In fact, many times, and there's other psalms that talk about how it seems like the wicked prosper. but we must know that there is coming a day where they will be judged. There is a judgment day coming. And so something that stands out to me in Psalm 1, one of my favorite Psalms, is that in verse number 1, there is a progression there. And we need to realize that, because there's also a progression in life and sliding away from God. So notice this progression. It starts out by saying, "Blessed is the man that walketh." So this individual walks. And then it goes to standing, and then it goes to sitting. So there's a progression there. Walking, and then standing and sitting. And if you notice that each one of those things is a little bit worse than the other. It starts out walking in the counsel of the ungodly. So you're simply walking in ungodly counsel, bad advice, if you would. And then secondly, next thing you know, you're standing in the way of sinners. So now you're not walking anymore. Now you're standing in one place, and it is the way of sinners. And then finally, the third thing, sitteth in the seat of the scornful. Next thing you know, you're sitting down. Right, you're dwelling somewhere. You're setting up your camp in the seat of the scornful, and the scornful are those that mock, those that scoff. In Psalm number 2, this psalm is about the king. It is messianic in nature, so it foretells of Jesus Christ, the Messiah. So it's very beautiful that we're getting into Matthew at the same time you're reading Psalm 2. And this psalm is quoted in the book of Hebrews, in particular, verse number 7. Verse number 7 says, "I will declare the decree. The Lord hath said unto me, Thou art my son. This day have I begotten thee." And so Hebrews tells us that is referring to Jesus Christ. The thing that stands out to me in Psalm 2 is verse number 12, a very beautiful thing. It says, "Kiss the Son, lest he be angry, and ye perish from the way, when his wrath is kindled but a little. Blessed are all they that put their trust in him." So I want you to think about that with me. Kiss the Son, lest he be angry. In other words, like kissing his hand, right? Bow before him before he gets angry. And a lot of times we picture Jesus is just soft and gentle, and you always see the picture of him as the shepherd, and he indeed is the shepherd. But not only is he a shepherd to those that are his sheep, but he also is the judge to those who are against him. And so you don't want to make him angry. It's a fearful thing to fall into the hands of an angry God. So kiss the Son, lest he be angry. Psalm 3. This is when David is fleeing from Absalom, his own son. He is forced to leave his palace in Jerusalem. He starts out by saying that there are many who rise up against him. David continually had enemies try to take him out, all of the time. He reveals in verse number 3 that God is his shield and the lifter of his head. David goes on to say that he cried unto the Lord, and God heard him. God has protected David from all of his enemies and is his salvation. The thing that stands out to me in that psalm is verse number 3. It says, "But thou, O Lord, art a shield for me, my glory, and the lifter up of mine head." He is the lifter up of mine head. And I was thinking about that with everything that's going on in the world right now, with our government, with society, with our culture, with the coronavirus, all that stuff. There's a lot of things to be discouraged about, but look to the Lord. He is our shield. He is our glory, and he is the lifter up of our head. He will lift you up. What a beautiful thing. Meditate upon that. In Psalm 4, we find David revealing that he calls unto God when he is in times of distress. He calls for others to do the same. He's encouraging others to do the same. And we should listen to David. We should call on God when we are in times of distress. He ends Psalm 4 by saying that he will lay down in peace and sleep. So why? Why can he do that? Because God is still there. There's an old saying, sleep now, God is still awake, and he can handle whatever troubles you. A lot of times, we might lose sleep, we might be stressed out, but we can go to sleep and we can rest in peace because understand that God is still there and he can handle whatever is troubling us. In Psalm 5, David does what he did in Psalm 1. He compares the wicked with the righteous. In verses 4 to 6 of Psalm 5, he describes things that will close God's ears. And so listen to this. What will close God's ears? It says, "For thou art not a God that hath pleasure in wickedness, neither shall evil dwell with thee. The foolish shall not stand in thy sight. Thou hatest all workers of iniquity. Thou shalt destroy them that speak leasing. The Lord will abhor the bloody and deceitful man." So you want God not to listen to your prayers? Then be involved in that stuff. It will close God's ears. He will not listen. But then David goes on to say in verse 7 how he will come to the Lord. Notice verse 7. He says, "But as for me, I will come into thy house in the multitude of thy mercy, and in thy fear will I worship toward thy holy temple." And so I'm going to come humbly. I'm going to come in a manner of worship. What a beautiful thing. And Psalm 6, David recognized the weakness of his own body. He realized his spiritual need for God's mercy. David prays here for physical healing and to be saved from death. Verse number 5, it says, in Psalm 6, it says, "For in death there is no remembrance of thee. In the grave, who shall give thee thanks?" So David's saying, if I die, how am I going to serve you? If I die, how am I going to give you thanks? How am I going to worship you here for others to see and for others to, so that I can declare your name to others that are around? And the end of the psalm, it turns to joy as David's prayers are answered. Notice verse 8. It says, "Depart from me, all ye workers of iniquity, for the Lord hath heard the voice of my weeping. The Lord hath heard my supplication. The Lord will receive my prayer. Let all mine enemies be ashamed and sore vexed. Let them return and be ashamed suddenly." And so he reveals that God answered his prayer. In Psalm 7, this psalm is David crying to God about the words that Cush said against him. David is asking God to be the judge in the matter and is even willing to for God to correct him if he has done wrong. And so David is literally praying to God, and he's saying, "Would you be the judge of this situation? Would you be the judge of this matter? And if I've done wrong, then punish me." The psalm portrays that God will judge those who are wicked. Let him be the judge because his judgments are perfect. A lot of times we want to take things into our own hands, in our own control, but this reveals that we should give them over to God and let him be the judge of the situation. Finally, in Psalm 8, the psalm for today, in this psalm, David praises the Lord. And this is another psalm that does point to Jesus. David talks about in Psalm 8 the fact that God created everything, and he examines the heavens and how God put them into their place. And the beautiful thing is that then he says, "When I consider thy heavens, the work of thy fingers, the moon and the stars which thou hast ordained," then David says, "What is man that thou art mindful of him?" In other words, when I look at everything that you have done and all of your creation, it brings me to the place where I just ask myself, who am I? What is man that you are mindful of him? In other words, look around you and then ask yourself this question: why does God care about me? Who are we that God would even care? And the fact that he does is a very beautiful thing, that he loves you and he loves me. What a beautiful thing. As I mentioned, this also does picture and point to and refer to Jesus Christ. Uh, Verse 5, it says, "For thou hast made him a little lower than the angels and hast crowned him with glory and honor." Understand that Hebrews also talks about that Jesus was made a little lower than the angels in order for him to become man and take upon himself human flesh. And so meditate on that thought. Who is man that thou art mindful of him? So now the Proverbs. And again, we're not going to take up too much time looking at these Proverbs, but I do want to point a couple things out to you. And in Proverbs 1, we find that Solomon is writing these words of wisdom to his son. He states that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Okay, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. So if you want to have knowledge, you want to have understanding, then we need to fear God. We need to reverence him for who he really is. And then he states that a wise man will hear and increase in learning. That's wisdom, is that you are continually learning. You're continually growing. Solomon then writes instructions to his son and asks him to wear them like an ornament. Think about it like a necklace, right? And he says, "Do not be enticed by sinners." These instructions, these things that I am going to give to you, they will help you to stay away from the trap. He talks here about that they spread out their net like a bird, right? They're setting out their trap, trying to trap you. And these words of wisdom, if you would wear them like an ornament, that they will keep you from the trap of the evil ones. In verse number 20 of Proverbs 1, he begins to describe wisdom like a person. He starts to describe wisdom like a person. It says, "Wisdom crieth out, she uttereth her voice in the streets. She crieth in the chief place of concourse, in the openings of the gates. In the city she uttereth her words." And so here we see him saying that wisdom's like this lady, right? And she's calling out from the street. But then he goes on and he says that those that ignore her, she will laugh at when they fall, because they did not learn and because they did not listen. Seems a little harsh. But we find in verses 28 to 31 that those that seek wisdom after they have already made foolish choices, they're a little too late. It says in verse 28, it says, "Then shall they call upon me, but I will not answer. They shall seek me early, but they shall not find me, for that they hated knowledge and did not choose the fear of the Lord. They would none of my counsel, they despised all my reproof. Therefore shall they eat of the fruit of their own way and be filled with their own devices." So in other words, you reap what you sow. And because you ignored and because you did not desire wisdom, you ignored the counsel and the instruction, you ultimately are going to have to face the consequences for the poor decisions that you have made. In chapter 2, he starts to portray wisdom like a treasure that we must seek. And so you search for it, and you search for it. And the greatest part of finding this wisdom is that it keeps us from the deception of evil. Why do we need wisdom? Ultimately, because it keeps us from being deceived by the enemy and by the evil one. So that's just a little bit of an overview of Matthew, of the Psalms, and of the Proverbs for the last 8 days. I hope that you have been reading, and I hope you continue to read through your Bible. And I pray that something has stood out to you. And if something in these readings stands out to you, make sure to email me, Pastor Nick Lewis at fmbcfresno.org, and just say, hey, this is what God has showed to me. I love to read that stuff. And so I love you guys. I hope that God is moving in your heart and in your life, and we'll see you soon. God bless.